It's 7 o'clock and this is a Sky News special programme on the Ukraine invasion. Our top story, 2 grim milestones after a week of war. Ukraine says 2,000 civilians have now died and Russia concedes almost 500 of its troops have been killed. Surrounded, bombarded and suffering mass casualties, we report on the city's hardest hit on day 7 of this conflict. Escaping war, we join those abandoning their homes and travelling out of Ukraine. The Chelsea owner, Roman Abramovich, confirms he's selling the club amid growing pressure for London's oligarchs to lose their assets. Here MPs pay their tributes to Ukraine as the Prime Minister adds his voice to those accusing Russia of war crimes. And cleared to compete, athletes from Russia and Belarus will be at the Paralympics but won't be able to fly their flag. Very good evening. 2,000 civilians dead, 21 of them children. These are sobering numbers released today by Ukrainian officials a week into Russia's invasion. For Russia's part, it has now conceded the loss of almost 500 of its soldiers in battle. Well, day 7 of the war saw Russia intensify its onslaught and tighten its grip on some of Ukraine's major cities. Ukrainian officials say a Russian bombardment in the eastern city of Kyiv has killed 21 people. Kyiv has also been the target of intensive air and artillery strikes. Ukraine says it shot down 2 Russian planes today. Now, that comes after 5 people were killed yesterday when the city's main television tower and a Holocaust memorial were hit. Officials in the southern city of Kherson say they were completely surrounded by Russian artillery today, while the mayor of Mariupol, which is in the southeast, reported mass casualties earlier. Well, Russia's defense ministry says 498 of its troops have now died. But as Alex Rossi now reports, the Russian assault goes on.
The attacks are more and more intense, with Russian forces now using heavy weapons in civilian areas. In the second city of Kharkiv, a university building crumbles after a missile strike. It's clearly not a military target. This place is home to 1.5 million people. For those remaining, nowhere is safe, even the bomb shelters.
I have kids at the age of 8, 10, 11, 12 and 13. All of them are afraid they will destroy Kharkiv for sure. They have no
We're going to leave Alex's report, bring that to you later, because we're taking this live. It's the French President Emmanuel Macron who has spoken to President Putin in the last couple of days.
To send it back to the darkest hours of the empires, of invasions, of exterminations. And this violent violation of the territory and the sovereignty of a European country, France and Europe responded immediately, unanimously, and firmly. We did it in close coordination with the British, the Canadians, the Americans, the Japanese, and so many other countries. First of all, by supporting the Ukrainian people through humanitarian convoys and also the delivery of equipment and materials to defend themselves. And then also by acting with the other countries so that the Russian leaders can hear that the choice of war would in fact put their country, make sure that their country was against all the countries. And the Security Council of the United Nations said that it was violation of human rights. And this very afternoon, the General Assembly of the United Nations condemned by a vote this aggression, this attack, and the international community has shown solidarity. The sports teams in Russia were excluded from international competitions, and a number of sports events were cancelled as well. We will carry on, and we will carry on to work in order to ensure that on all continents the nations will condemn the invasion insist upon a ceasefire, and also to ensure humanitarian actions in Ukraine. We have very rapidly taken sanctions, set up sanctions with regard to Russia and its leaders. And there are the assets of hundreds of Russian personalities have been frozen in France and abroad. A number of major Russian banks were excluded from international payments, which meant that a number of transactions were impossible. And the propaganda organs in Russia have stopped emitting in Europe. On the ground, we've given the ways to actually protect our nationals by organizing the transfer of our embassy to another town in Ukraine, and also allowing all French people, whoever wanted to be able to leave the country as soon as possible. And here in your name, I'd like to thank all of the diplomats, police officers, military and state agents who carry on with this effort and who are looking after our citizens in Moldavia and in the main exit points of the Ukrainian territory. I'd also like to thank all the journalists that cover with courage this conflict and also are trying to ensure the freedom of information for all citizens of the world. Finally, we have participated in this effort within the framework of NATO in order to protect the security and the sovereignty of our European allies by reinforcing the military presence that we already have in the Baltic states and in the region. And hundreds of French soldiers arrived yesterday in Romania. And this was a diplomatic initiative, sanctions against the political and economic leaders of Russia, supporting the Ukrainian population. So therefore, that's going to carry on and it will be intensified. And the aim is to ensure that combat stops. But at the same time, we are not at war against Russia. We all know what associates us with this major European population and country that did so much in order to save Europe and during the Second World War. So today, we're at the side of all Russians who refuse an undignified war in their name and the spirit of responsibility and courage of defending peace. And they certainly say this in Russia and elsewhere. And for that reason, if I constantly talk to the President Zelensky, I also chose to keep in contact, and I will keep in contact as much as possible and as much as necessary with President Putin in order to try to find, without fail, to try to convince him to give up arms, to help him as much as possible with regard to the talks underway, and also to avoid the contagion and the increase of this conflict as much as possible. The balance within our continent, as with regard to a number of aspects on a daily basis, has been unbalanced, and there will be some changes in the coming months. Europe will certainly be affected by this, and I'll come back to it. There are hundreds of thousands of refugees coming from Ukraine, will be received on our continent and are received on our continent, and France will play its own role. And I'd also like to thank our towns and our villages that have mobilized, and to thank our charitable organizations who are also trying to receive these people. And we organize ourselves, and we will take care of those who are coming to our country to be protected. France will also play its role by receiving the children who are in exile, separated from their fathers who are there fighting. And we'll do this in close collaboration with associations and NGOs who are already offering this in our country. And our agriculture, our industry, and a number of economic sectors are suffering and will suffer, either because they depend on the importation of raw materials from Russia or Ukraine, or because they're exporting towards those countries. And our growth today will certainly be affected. And petrol prices, gas, raw materials, of course, this will have there'll be some responses. The increase in petrol, the increase in heating, the cost of certain products will in fact go up, for sure. And so these economic and social consequences, I will just have the only thing I want to do is to protect him, protect you. We're going to, of course, support certain areas. We're going to try to find new suppliers and certain new outlets. And so with Americans, Europeans, and people from the Middle East, we're trying to work out other solutions. We're trying to look at the commercial flows and also an increase of prices. And I've asked the Prime Minister to draw up in the coming days a plan with regard to economic and social resilience to be able to respond to all these difficulties. But let's not be mistaken, these events will not only have immediate consequences within the next few weeks, they are events that are signaling a change in our time. The war in Europe no longer belongs to our history books or our textbooks at school. Now we're living this in front of our eyes. Democracy is no longer considered as being uncontestable. Democracy is being questioned. And our freedom, that of our children, is no longer something that's simply a fact. It's simply a system of courage, and it's a fight of every instant. We're returning to a tragedy in history, and we've got to respond by making historical decisions. Our country will therefore increase investment in defense and will pursue its strategy of independence and investment in its economy, research, innovation, and which has also already been reinforced because of the pandemic. Our Europe is demonstrating, as it has done in the previous months, a remarkable unity, and it now must accept to pay the price for peace, for freedom, for democracy. And it must also invest in order to depend less on the other continents and decide for itself. In other words, become a more independent power, a more sovereign power, economic power, first of all. We can no longer depend on the others to feed ourselves, to look after ourselves, to inform us, to finance ourselves. So that's why, with the decisions during the pandemic, we've got to make sure that we promote a new economic model founded on independence and progress. As far as energy is concerned, we can no longer depend on others, and we can't depend on Russian gas in order to heat our homes and so on. So after having decided for France with regard to the development of renewable energies and the construction of new nuclear reactors to defend a strategy of independence, energetic independence, and we can no longer depend on others to defend us, whether we're talking about on the ground, at sea, undersea, in the air, or in cyberspace or space. And as far as that's concerned, our European defense must go through a new stage. I'll gather together on the 10th and or 11th of March heads of state at a summit which will decide upon all these matters. And our Europe has demonstrated unity and determination, and it's entered a new era which we have to carry on. Dear citizens, the war in Ukraine marks a rupture as far as our continent is concerned and our generation. I know to what extent it concerns you legitimately. It mobilizes us, and it will also mean that we'll have to take certain decisions. And you realize that this war is also affecting our democratic life and the electoral campaign that officially opens at the end of this week. This campaign will allow a democratic debate, which will be important for the nation, but at the same time, it won't stop us from gathering together as far as essentials are concerned. I'm able to count on you. I know I can count on you and your attachment to freedom, to equality, to fraternity, and to the place of France within the world. I will never stop defending them and also defending those values. Long live the Republic, long live France.
Well, that was the French president. As you could see, Emmanuel Macron speaking in the last few minutes and emphasising first and foremost the unity, the unanimity of approach from the West towards Russia in its invasion of Ukraine, the unity of NATO, the EU and all the allies. Talking then specifically about what France has been doing, about the assets of the oligarchs, Russian oligarchs that it has frozen, just like in the UK. Also talking about his diplomatic contacts, which has been very important from the point of view of France. You may remember that Emmanuel Macron a couple of weeks ago went to Moscow and came back from that meeting with President Putin under the impression that he had got undertakings from President Putin not to invade Ukraine. Of course, that turned out not to be the case. But President Macron there saying that he will continue to talk to President Zelensky of Ukraine and President Putin. He will keep those contacts open. Very interestingly, he also said there he had to walk back some comments from his finance minister yesterday, Bruno Le Maire, who commented yesterday in this fraught environment, perhaps used some unwise words. Bruno Le Maire referred to the all-out economic and financial war that the West was carrying out on Russia. Those comments, of course, were poorly received in Moscow, but Emmanuel Macron there making it very clear. He said, we are not at war with Russia. We just want them to stop the violence. So plenty there to unpick from the French president. The main thing being that there is a unanimity, continuing unanimity of approach throughout the West to the violence in Ukraine carried out by the Russians, and that he will keep those diplomatic contacts as open as much as possible. Well, as we've been hearing, it has been another intense day of fighting, a week into this war, just 7 days. So let's take a closer look at the movements of Russian troops on the ground. Sky's Kamali Melbourne is at the screen with the security and defence analyst Michael Clark.
As we can see, Russian forces are arrayed in many areas around the country. Michael, what does this look like on day 7 of this conflict?
Well, Kamali, here we are on day 7. The Russians started with what I would describe as a plan B. They were trying to do it the way Western forces would have done it, with fast, reasonably lightly armoured forces rushing through the areas to capture cities, and a dash to Kyiv, an aerial assault on Kyiv, which they tried and failed, to grab the government, get the whole thing over in 72 hours. They made a mess of it. The Ukrainians are fighting ferociously, and so they've now gone back to plan A, which is what they know how to do, which is a slower-moving series of fronts, as the front down the Dnieper Valley there that you've marked, to surround Kyiv and the major cities and take them slowly. This has now become a war of the cities. The Ukrainians didn't have enough troops to try to guard the whole country. They only defended the cities, quite rightly, but now the Russians are moving in on those cities, and there is a sort of a northern war and a southern war. As they become consolidated, they'll then try to join them up right through the Dnieper Valley there.
Yeah, we'll talk in more detail now about that southern war. It's, of course, based as a jumping-off point is Crimea, that was taken by the Russians back in 2014. And there is fierce fighting, as we understand it, for the city of Kherson being contested right now, and for the city of Mariupol. Tell us why those cities are strategically important, Michael.
Yes, Kherson is very important because it's a big regional city, and you have to hold that if you're going to create this land corridor, which is now clearly the objective. Moving out of the Donbass disputed areas, Mariupol, unbelievable. That should have fallen within hours. And here we are on day 7, and they are still fighting at Mariupol. According to the Ukrainian government, they are still holding on in Mariupol. How they're doing it, I don't know. Sooner or later, that land corridor will be effectively joined up. And then we would expect that corridor to go towards Odessa, the ancient port of Ukraine. And so that corridor will continue on westwards and then start to push northwards up the Dnieper Valley in order to link up with forces that by then probably will have taken Kyiv.
Those forces that are pushing down from the north. Let's just take a look again at the wider map of Ukraine, Michael, because, of course, in the past 24 hours and for the past week or so, there have been calls for the West to do more. Sanctions are, of course, in place, but there are calls for a no-fly zone, and there have been calls in the past few hours for a humanitarian corridor. Just how likely are any of those things, do you think, at this point?
Humanitarian corridor is plausible, not easy at the moment, but a humanitarian corridor on the ground with some sort of UN supervision or supervision from the Organisation of Security and Cooperation in Europe, that's plausible to have ground corridors. No-fly zones is a non-starter because the way no-fly zones have to work is that aircraft have to attack anti-aircraft and radar stations on the ground. And the one thing that will not happen is NATO aircraft attacking Russian anti-aircraft and radar stations that have now established themselves on the ground in Ukraine. That's a recipe for war. We're not going to do it.
Now, the owner of Chelsea Football Club, Roman Abramovich, has confirmed that he is actively looking now to sell the club. It's seen, of course, as a preemptive move amid growing calls for London's super-rich oligarchs to be stripped of their assets. Today, during Prime Minister's questions, Labour urged the government to introduce harder and tougher sanctions. Our deputy political editor, Sam Coates, reports now on the oligarchs being targeted.
Solidarity, unity, respect. Rare applause from MPs as the House of Commons rose as one for the Ukrainian ambassador. He and the country heard the strongest condemnation yet from Boris Johnson.
What we have seen already from Vladimir Putin's regime in the use of the munitions that they have already been dropping on innocent civilians, Mr. Speaker, in my view, already fully qualifies as a war crime.
But it's actions, not words, demanded by the Labour leader. What about the owner of Chelsea Football Club, Roman Abramovich?
He's a person of interest to the Home Office because of his links to the Russian state and his public association with corrupt activity and practices. Last week, the Prime Minister said that Abramovich is facing sanctions. He later corrected the record to say that he isn't. Well, why on earth isn't he?
There's more to come, says Boris Johnson.
What we will publish in addition, Mr. Speaker, is a full list of all those associated with the Putin regime. The vice is tightening on the Putin regime, and it will continue to tighten.
Calls came from all sides to do more, even using the legal protections of Parliament to list possible targets.
I don't want war, nobody wants war, but we're not even sanctioning Sergei Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, yet, nor Igor Osipov, the commander of the Black Sea Fleet, or Uzmanov, Sechin, Peskov, Abramovich, Roldugin, or the members of the Russian Duma who voted for this war.
At Prime Minister's questions, Keir Starmer said that 2 flats in here, worth £11 million, are just a few hundred yards from Downing Street, are owned by an ally of Vladimir Putin. Igor Shavalov is on the EU sanctions list, but not on the British one. Keir Starmer asked why. Now, officials say that cases involving Russian oligarchs are tricky. They take time. They don't want to end up making mistakes and in court. But pressure is building on all sides to fill the gaps in the sanctions regime.
Tonight, the oligarch sell-off begins. Roman Abramovich announced he is selling Chelsea Football Club, thought to be asking £4 billion for it and promising the proceeds will go to the victims of the Ukraine conflict. More sanctions are coming, more sell-offs likely, unpicking a 3-decade relationship with modern Russia in haste. Sam Coates, Sky News, Westminster.
Well, now, the United Nations General Assembly overwhelmingly voted to condemn Russia for its invasion of Ukraine today. The UN also demanded that Russia stops the attack and withdraws its troops. In total, 141 nations supported the motion and only 5, including Belarus, opposed it.
For those who remain, Russia is destroying critical infrastructure, vital services which provide millions of people across Ukraine with drinking water to stay alive, gas to keep people from freezing to death. And now it appears Russia is preparing to increase the brutality of its campaign against Ukraine. We've seen videos of Russian forces moving exceptionally lethal weaponry into Ukraine, which has no place on the battlefield. That includes cluster munitions and vacuum bombs, which are banned under the Geneva Convention.
Well, let's talk to our US correspondent, Mark Stone. And Mark, very clearly, Russia has precious few friends left at the UN.
Yes, a chamber that exposed those who are sticking by their old ally, Russia. Just 4 countries plus Russia, voted against this resolution. They are North Korea, Eritrea, Syria and Belarus. Clearly countries that you would expect to vote this way. The abstentions were interesting for their own geopolitical calculations. 34 countries decided to abstain, among them Cuba, China, India, Kazakhstan, Zimbabwe, and a number of other African nations as well. I think within those group of abstaining nations, perhaps that is the avenue for diplomacy. We know that the Chinese the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi spoke to the Ukrainian Foreign Minister over the past 24 hours. The Ukrainian Foreign Minister has also spoken to the Indian Foreign Minister. Now, both China and India have close diplomatic relations with the Russians, as does Israel. Israel's Prime Minister has been speaking to both sides. If there is an attempt to find a diplomatic solution here, then does it come from one of those avenues? Perhaps. And I think certainly officials within the United Nations have been stressing that diplomacy is the only answer. But as a message of isolation, it was one heck of a message. The screen that went up in the UN Security Council showing all those countries voting with this for this resolution, non-binding, not legal, but a clear message, and just so few voting against. So that is that, Dermot. Here in Washington, we've had some more updates, as we get every day, from the Department of Defense, the Pentagon here. They say now that 82% of the forces that Vladimir Putin committed to Ukraine that were mounting on the border are now inside Ukraine. So very few, still a large number, but a small percentage left on the Russian side. 450 missiles have now been fired. They have been struck at the Pentagon at how little artillery has been used. In a conventional invasion of a country, the first thing you would do is fire an awful lot of artillery from your side of the border into the country you're invading. The Russians haven't done that. Now, the Russians are saying that's because we're trying to prevent civilian casualties. The truth is that there are many civilian casualties, but for one reason or another, they haven't been using the artillery that might have been expected. I suppose that has perhaps reduced the number of civilian deaths that we could have seen, although the Americans are quite clear that civilians are being hit in relatively large numbers, and we've seen the evidence of that. As for that column of armoured vehicles, of Russian armoured vehicles, 40 miles long, heading towards Kyiv, it is still stalled, so say the Americans. They believe there are supply problems, food and fuel problems as well, or are the Russians just regrouping to try and move in at another point? The Americans just don't know on that one.
OK, Mark.
And Dermot, as we await...
Yeah, I think Mark was just about to tell us the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken is giving us an update, so let's listen.
The assault continues by land, by air, by sea, and as I noted in my remarks at the UN Human Rights Council just yesterday, Russian strikes are hitting schools, hospitals, residences. They're destroying critical infrastructure, which supplies millions of people across Ukraine with drinking water, with electricity, with gas to keep from freezing to death. Buses, cars, ambulances being shelled. Yesterday, Russian strikes in Kyiv struck the capital's main television and radio tower and destroyed part of the Babi Yar Holocaust Memorial. Apartment buildings outside of Kyiv were hit, partially collapsed. A huge explosion occurred in the main square of Kharkiv, Ukraine's second largest city. These aren't military targets. They are places where civilians work and families live. Kharkiv is one of the largest Russian-speaking cities in Europe. It's fewer than 50 miles from Belgorod, its sister city in Russia. And Belgorod is where the missiles against Kharkiv were likely fired. President Putin, among the many false justifications he's given for invading Ukraine, has cited the need to protect against an imaginary threat to Russian ethnic and Russian-speaking peoples. How is assaulting and bombing the population of Kharkiv, again, one of the largest Russian-speaking cities in Europe, advancing that purported goal? As President Zelensky said after the assault, there was never a border between Kharkiv and its Russian sister city. The two cities are joined in the hearts of Ukrainian and Russian people living on either side. Among the great damage we see from war, we're seeing that in Kyiv. We've also seen that the International Court of Justice has announced that it will hold hearings on Russia's actions. Already the human costs of the Kremlin's unwarranted, unprovoked, and unjustified war on Ukraine are staggering. Hundreds, if not thousands, of civilians have been killed and wounded. There are now more than 174,000 refugees who've sought safety in nearby countries. Millions of Ukrainians still in Ukraine are sheltering wherever they can, including children receiving cancer treatment, who are now living in the basements of Ukraine's children's hospitals, with doctors and nurses doing their best to care for them as explosions boom overhead. This is shameful. The numbers of civilians killed and wounded, the humanitarian consequences, will only grow in the days ahead. In the face of this violence, the courage of the Ukrainian people is inspiring the world. As President Biden said in his State of the Union address last night, the response to Russia's war has been unity. Unity among world leaders, unity in Europe, unity among people gathering around the world to protest President Putin's war of choice, including thousands of people in Russia and Belarus coming out to protest peacefully, even though they know what they risk in so doing. Because the Biden administration dedicated its first year to repairing and rebuilding our alliances and partnerships in Europe and around the world, and because we spent the better part of the past several months raising alarms about looming Russian aggression, declassifying and sharing our intelligence nearly in real time, and relentlessly exposing President Putin's lies, we were ready. In fact, one reason why we're seeing the unified response now is because we made the decision late last year to publicize to the world what we knew was underway and the playbook we were convinced Russia would follow. I went to the UN Security Council 2 weeks ago to walk through, step by step, the pretext for war that we were sure President Putin would invent and the subsequent military invasion that he planned to order. And that's precisely what he did, while Russian officials continued to deny it right until the invasion began. Seeing that duplicity and premeditated aggression play out exactly as we had predicted has generated outrage and solidarity across Europe and around the world. And that's turned into unprecedented action. We said that if the Kremlin ordered an invasion, we would help Ukraine defend itself while imposing costs on Russia. Last week, the president approved $350 million in military assistance to Ukraine to help with the armored, airborne, and other significant threats it now faces. That brings our total security assistance to Ukraine in the past year to more than $1 billion, more than in any previous year. Over the past several days, I authorized the expedited transfer of U.S.-origin defensive equipment from allies to Ukraine, and we're coordinating efforts to get this equipment, including anti-tank and anti-aircraft weaponry, as well as small arms and munitions, into the hands of Ukrainian fighters who are defending their country with skill and determination. We're sending humanitarian assistance to the people of Ukraine as well. 3 days ago, we announced nearly $54 million in additional support, on top of the more than $300 million that we provided in recent years. USAID has deployed a disaster assistance response team, our top international emergency responders, to lead the U.S. humanitarian response in coordination with European allies, partners, and international organizations. And USAID Director Samantha Power was, as you know, just in Poland along the border with Ukraine a few days ago, along with other senior officials from the State Department. And we're working to support the frontline countries, including Poland, Moldova, Romania, Hungary, and Slovakia, that have welcomed hundreds of thousands of refugees, including many children, elderly people, people with disabilities, all of whom are fleeing Ukraine to escape Russia's violence and facing harrowing journeys to reach safety. We and our allies and partners will work to keep people safe, manage the flow of refugees, keep border crossings open, and provide critical supplies. At the same time, we're holding Russia accountable, including Russia's economy. Back on December 1st, I said that Russia would face massive consequences for attacking Ukraine, including severe and lasting economic costs. The United States and more than 30 allies and partners, representing more than half the world's economy, have made good on that commitment, with powerful sanctions and export controls on Russia, including additional actions just today. We've now sanctioned most of Russia's largest financial institutions and its sovereign wealth fund. The European Union removed key sanctioned Russian banks from the SWIFT international payments network. We've restricted Russia's ability to seek funding beyond its borders. 13 of the most critical Russian state-owned enterprises, including Gazprom, are now extremely limited in raising money through the U.S. market. We've imposed sanctions on individuals, including President Putin, other members of Russia's Security Council, and elites and their family members. And we and our allies and partners are launching a task force to identify, track down, and freeze the assets of sanctioned Russian companies and oligarchs. We will freeze and seize their yachts, their private jets, their opulent estates in world capitals. Today, we're also imposing sweeping sanctions on Russia's defense sector. In total, 22 Russian defense-related entities will be designated, including companies that make combat aircraft, infantry fighting vehicles, missiles, unmanned aerial vehicles, electronic warfare systems, the very systems now being used to assault the Ukrainian people, abuse human rights, violate international humanitarian law. We're also imposing export controls on Belarus to hold the Lukashenko regime accountable for being a co-belligerent in President Putin's war of choice. We will choke off Belarus's ability to import key technologies. And if Lukashenko's support for the war continues, the consequences for his regime will escalate. All told, these sanctions and restrictions have had a powerful effect on Russia's economy. The value of the ruble has plummeted. The Russian stock market closed as fear of capital flight rose. Interest rates more than doubled. Russia's credit rating has been cut to junk status. The value of President Putin's war fund has vanished. And by choking Russia's access to technology, we're delivering a blow to its economy and military that will be felt not just now, but for years to come. President Putin may have assumed that the United States and our allies were bluffing when we warned of massive, unprecedented consequences. But, as President Biden likes to say, big nations can't bluff. The United States doesn't bluff, and President Putin has gravely miscalculated. As President Biden made clear last night, this is President Putin's war. This isn't the Russian people's war. It's becoming clearer by the day that the Russian people oppose it. Members of the Russian military oppose it and had no idea what they were being sent to do. And now the Russian people will suffer the consequences of their leaders' choices. So, my message to the people of Russia, if they're even able to hear it, as the Kremlin cracks down even harder on media outlets reporting the truth, my message is that we know many of you want no part of this war. You, like Ukrainians, like Americans, like people everywhere, want the same basic things. Good jobs, clean air and water, the chance to raise your kids in safe neighborhoods, to send them to good schools, to give them better lives than you had. How in the world does President Putin's unprovoked aggression against Ukraine help you achieve any of these things? How is it going to make your lives better? The economic costs that we've been forced to impose on Russia are not aimed at you. They're aimed at compelling your government to stop its actions, to stop its aggression. And just as millions of us around the world stand together against Moscow's aggression, we also stand together with you as you demand that your leaders end this war. If President Putin wants to demonstrate leadership, he should allow Russian soldiers to go home to their families. Finally, the United States is continuing our diplomatic efforts. We're keeping the door open to a diplomatic way forward. That's going to be very hard to happen without military de-escalation. It's much more difficult for diplomacy to succeed when guns are firing, tanks are rolling, planes are flying. But if Russia pulls back and pursues diplomacy, we stand ready to do the same thing. Meanwhile, our intensive diplomacy with allies and partners continues. I've been in virtually daily contact with my friend and counterpart, Ukraine's Foreign Minister Kuleba. And I've made clear that we'll support any diplomatic efforts by the Ukrainian government to reach a ceasefire and withdrawal of Russian forces. If there are diplomatic steps that we can take that the Ukrainian government believes would be helpful, we're prepared to take them, even as we continue to support Ukraine's ability to defend itself. Tomorrow, I'll travel to Brussels, where I'll meet with our NATO, European Union, and G7 allies and partners to continue our coordination, to commend them on the unprecedented steps that they've taken to support Ukraine and hold Russia to account, and to reaffirm our Article 5 commitment that an attack on any NATO member is an attack on all. From there, I'll travel to Poland, which is already hosting hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian refugees, with tens of thousands arriving by the day. And then to Moldova, which is also hosting Ukrainian refugees, and where Russian troops have been occupying territory against the will of the people for years. And then I'll go on to the Baltic countries, to Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, which are facing a renewed threat from Russia themselves as President Putin seeks to reassert Russia's dominance over former Soviet republics. Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia are our NATO allies. And as President Biden has said, we will defend every inch of NATO territory against any aggression, from Russia or otherwise. Finally, I want to note the consequential and historic vote that just took place in the United Nations. 141 member states voted in favor of a resolution reaffirming Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity and condemning Russia's invasion of another member state. As this vote revealed, the overwhelming majority of the international community stands in strong support of the core principles of the United Nations and upholding the UN Charter, and stands against Russia's reckless attempts to change the borders of another sovereign country by force to replace its will for the will of the Ukrainian people. As 141 member states of the United Nations know, more is at stake even than the conflict in Ukraine itself and the freedom and security of Ukraine and its people. This is a threat to stability in Europe and to the entire rules-based order, which has been the foundation of security and prosperity for people around the world for nearly 80 years. In this time of uncertainty, we have a clear way forward. Help Ukraine defend itself, support the Ukrainian people, hold Russia accountable, and persist with diplomacy. President Putin is more isolated from the world than ever before. As President Biden predicted last night, when the history of this era is written, Russia's war on Ukraine will have left Russia weaker and the rest of the world stronger. And in the days ahead, we'll continue to draw inspiration from the iron will of the Ukrainian people. With that, happy to take some questions.
Hello, Mr. Secretary. Thanks for being here. I just want to ask you, what is the U.S. assessment on Putin's state of mind? You said that he's more isolated than before. Do you worry that this isolation might prompt him to lash out and do something even more dramatic than we've so far seen on the ground? And I also want to ask you, I'm sure you've seen that there are Americans who have expressed their desire to go and join the fight in Ukraine. What is your message to them? Thank you.
Thanks. I can't put myself in President Putin's mind or state of mind. All that we can focus on are the actions that he's taking. and our response to those actions. I said before, one of the Achilles heels of autocracies is the inability to speak truth to power. I don't know who said what to President Putin before he launched this aggression. I don't know who's saying what to him now. But again, all of that is speculation. We can't put ourselves in his mindset. All we can do is what we're doing, which is to be very clear in how we'll respond to the actions that he takes, to continue to work in unity with allies and partners in support of Ukraine, in defense of Ukraine, to help its people, to help those who've been forced to flee, and if there are any diplomatic opportunities to pursue those. But we're focused less on what President Putin thinks or may think, and more on what he does. And with regard to the second part of your question, look, we've been very clear for some time, of course, in calling on Americans who may have been resident in Ukraine to leave, and making clear to Americans who may be thinking of traveling there not to go. For those who want to help Ukraine and help its people, there are many ways to do that, including by supporting and helping the many NGOs that are working to provide humanitarian assistance, providing resources themselves to groups that are trying to help Ukraine, by being advocates for Ukraine and for a peaceful resolution to this crisis that was created by Russia. Those are the most effective ways that people who want to help can do so.
Andrew.
Mr. Secretary, you just quoted the president saying big nations don't bluff. Mm-hmm. Do you think that President Putin is bluffing by putting his nuclear forces on alert? And I had another question, if you don't mind. Are you surprised that we have not seen more? We've seen some denial of services, but are you surprised that we have not seen a more massive cyber attack against Ukraine or against other of the NATO nations or against us? Do you think that the legislation that just passed improves our ability to defend against such attacks? And if I could impose on you one more question. I talked today to Daria Kaleniuk, who is part of the president in your democracy summit this year. And you know how passionate she is, perhaps you saw her questioning. And she says that despite everything that has been done, and I would say it's an extraordinary amount of coordination and agreement with the allies, it's not going to get there in time. That convoy is sitting outside Kyiv and poised to encircle Kyiv, and they're not going to get those supplies. What more can be done to help those people?
Andrew, thank you. Let me take them in not quite reverse order. First, just on the cyber piece, two things. First, yes, the legislation that you referred to is extremely helpful. But beyond that and before that, we have been very focused on the potential for cyber attacks, not only against Ukraine, but against us, against allies and partners. We've been working for months, first with Ukraine, and also among ourselves, to harden, to sharpen defenses. All of that work is very much underway, including with the private sector. And so I think we have to be very much on guard about that possibility. We are. With regard to assistance to Ukraine, here's what I can tell you. We are very actively working every day, every hour, to provide that assistance and to make sure that to the best of our ability it gets to where it needs to go. And this is not just us, this is many countries in Europe. We're coordinating a lot of efforts to do that. And my own assessment right now is that the vitally needed assistance is getting to where it needs to go. With regard to President Putin's statements on Russia's nuclear posture. First, as you know, Russia and the United States have long agreed that the actual use of nuclear weapons would be devastating and have devastating consequences for the entire world. And as we've stated many times, including earlier this year, following the meeting between President Biden and President Putin in Geneva, both of our countries have stated that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. That was a key reaffirmation coming out of the meeting between President Biden and President Putin back in June. Provocative rhetoric about nuclear weapons is the height of irresponsibility. It's dangerous. It adds to the risk of miscalculation. It needs to be avoided. We've assessed President Putin's directive and his statements, and at this time, we see no reason to change our own alert levels.
Thanks.
Matt.
Mr. Secretary, thank you. You mentioned the vote in the UN, which was by, it was overwhelming, as you said. And the countries that voted against, the 5 countries who voted against, no surprise, Belarus, Eritrea, North Korea, Syria, and Russia. But I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about the abstentions, particularly from Latin America, Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, who stayed out. These are countries that are no stranger to larger powers, who shall go unnamed, getting involved in their internal policy. I'm wondering if that says anything to you. And then, secondly, on the prospects for diplomacy with Russia, which you said you're keeping the door open to. I mean, really, what are the prospects for? What are the chances of that happening? And is there, if there is an open door, is it just for Ukraine and potentially the Iran talks in Vienna, or are you open to the whole gamut of things, the arms control, climate, any number of other things? Thank you.
Matt, first of all, to put the vote in the UN in perspective, it is both overwhelming and I would even say historic. Go back to 2014. When the General Assembly pronounced itself on Russia's initial aggression against Ukraine. The votes in favor of that resolution were 100. Then go to the horrific actions that the Assad regime took in Aleppo. The vote there was 120 in favor of a resolution condemning the actions of the Assad regime. Today, 141 votes. That speaks powerfully and eloquently about the overwhelming majority of the world and its views about what Russia is doing in Ukraine. I'm not going to parse the individual votes. I think in some cases, an abstention actually speaks loudly itself, as opposed to a no vote. So I think you have to look at some of the individual countries, assess their relationship with Russia, and look at how they voted in that context. For the small number that voted against, Belarus, the DPRK, Eritrea, Syria, as well as, of course, Russia, as Groucho Marx once sort of said, this is not very much a club that I would want to be a member of.
Oh, wait, sorry, on the prospects for diplomacy.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. Look, as I said a moment ago, with regard to Ukraine itself, we, of course, remain open to pursuing any reasonable path, but it's very hard to see any path when the bombs are dropping, the planes are flying, the tanks are rolling. So de-escalation, pulling back forces, that would open a path to diplomacy. And we, I think, demonstrated very clearly in the months leading up to Russia's aggression that we were prepared to engage Russia diplomatically on any legitimate security concerns on a reciprocal basis. That remains, unfortunately, tragically, horrifically. I think we've seen, and you don't have to take my word for it, just listen to President Putin's own words, that virtually everything the Russian government professed to be concerned about was not really what was at issue. For example, Ukraine joining NATO. What President Putin has said loudly and clearly, and is now demonstrated by the actions that Russia has taken, is that what this is about for him is Ukraine being absorbed in one fashion or another into Russia. He sees Ukraine as having no independent existence. He wants to reincorporate it into an empire, short of that, to make it part of a renewed sphere of influence, or maybe at the very least, to make it totally neutral. So this is about way more than the issues that we were prepared to engage Russia on. So two quick pieces on the diplomacy now. One, with regard to Ukraine itself, first and foremost, the question is if Ukraine thinks there is a path that would help advance its interests, protect it, and the war, and we can be helpful in that, of course, we're fully prepared to do that. But we really look to the Ukrainian government to see what, if anything, might make sense. They're engaged in talks with Russia. They had one round. There may be another one. We'll see. But of course, the demands that Russia put on the table were beyond excessive. They were, of course, non-starters. And what we've seen repeatedly is that Russia goes through the pretense of diplomacy to distract and continue on its aggressive path. More broadly, even as we've imposed and continue to impose massive costs on Russia for its aggression and actions in Ukraine, if we determine that there are areas that it's in our interest to continue to pursue and that in one fashion or another may involve some engagement from Russia, we'll continue to pursue that. We're not going to let Russia dictate in any way what's in our interests and how to pursue them.
Time for a final question from Olga. Media Ukraine. Just a few days ago, European Union proposed to donate their fighter jets to Ukraine to protect our sky. But as far as I know, for now, this deal has fallen apart. I know that you were on a phone call with Foreign Minister Kuleba today discussing this topic as well. Could one expect that after your travel to Europe, something could change and Ukraine will get access to those jets?
Thank you. I can't comment in detail on my conversations with Foreign Minister Kuleba. We talked about a lot of things, including the ongoing provision of security assistance to Ukraine, and that is something that I will be talking to European allies and partners about in a couple of days in Brussels. Again, I can tell you, as I mentioned in response to Andrea's question, that when it comes to vital defensive military equipment that Ukraine needs, we are very actively coordinating its provision, and that assistance is getting there. But we'll probably have more to say in the next couple of days.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, an important address there by the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken. Just taking one more question. Let's hear it.
We've certainly seen in the past that one of Russia's methods of war is to be absolutely brutal in trying to cow the citizenry of a given country. And that includes, at the very least, indiscriminate targeting and potentially deliberate targeting as well. We're looking very closely at what's happening in Ukraine right now, including what's happening to civilians. We're taking account of it. We're documenting it, and we want to ensure, among other things, that there's accountability for it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, your Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, there making some very sober, measured and direct comments about the Russian aggression, the invasion of Ukraine. Quick thoughts from our US correspondent, Mark Stone, in Washington on that. Mark, what stood out for you?
Well, there were a couple of news lines, new things that we learnt, but much of it was a reflection on what has happened and an assessment of where things are now. In terms of the new lines, he did talk about new sanctions specifically against the Russian defence industry that would be coming into play very, very soon, and some sweeping sanctions on Belarus as well. Of course, Russia's accomplice in this invasion. Sanctions against Belarus that will be increased over the coming days if it does not separate itself from this Russian adventure into Ukraine. He had a message too for the Russian people. He said, "This isn't we are not targeting you. We are targeting your leadership." And he also made clear that he wouldn't be drawn on President Putin's state of mind.
OK, Mark Stone in Washington. Thank you very much indeed. And it is coming up to 8 o'clock, and you're watching a Sky News special programme on the Ukraine invasion. The top story is 2 grim milestones after a week so far of war. Ukraine says 2,000 civilians have now died, and Russia concedes almost 500 of its troops have been killed. Surrounded, bombarded and suffering mass casualties, we report on the city's hardest hit on day 7 of this conflict. The Chelsea Football Club owner Roman Abramovich confirms he's selling the club amid growing pressure for London's oligarchs to lose their assets. Here MPs pay their tribute to Ukraine as the Prime Minister adds his voice to those accusing Russia of war crimes. And cleared to compete, athletes from Russia and Belarus will be at the Paralympics but will not be able to fly their flag. A very good evening. 2,000 civilians dead, 21 of them children. Well, these are sobering numbers released today by Ukrainian officials a week into Russia's invasion. Russian officials said today that almost 500 of its troops have been killed in the conflict. Well, day 7 of the war saw Russia intensify its onslaught and tighten its grip on major cities. Ukrainian officials say a Russian bombardment in the eastern city of Kyiv has killed 21 people. Kyiv has also been the target of intensive air and artillery attacks. Ukraine says it shot down 2 Russian aircraft today. It comes after 5 people were killed yesterday when the city's main television tower and a Holocaust memorial were hit. Officials in the southern city of Kherson said they were completely surrounded by Russian artillery today, while the mayor of Mariupol, which is in the southeast, reported mass casualties earlier. Well, Russia's defence ministry says 498 of its troops have now died. But as Alex Rossi now reports from the city of Dnipro, the Russian assault goes on.
The attacks are more and more intense, with Russian forces now using heavy weapons in civilian areas. In the second city of Kharkiv, a university building crumbles after a missile strike. It's clearly not a military target. This place is home to 1.5 million people. For those remaining, nowhere is safe, even the bomb shelters.
I have kids at the age of 8, 10, 11, 12 and 13. All of them are afraid they will destroy Kharkiv for sure. They have no limits. They have no moral. They have no one human